What's going on, everybody? It's Frito here for Your Overwatch. Blizzard released the rest of the VODs of the early Overwatch 2 Pro playtest, and then held a developer Ask Me Anything on the competitive Overwatch subreddit, following up on questions that were raised after looking at this new build of the game. The devs take extreme measures to let everyone know that this is all early iteration, lots of it subject to change, including some massive changes had already gone through to their internal build after testing it out with the pros. However, I think what will be useful, as always, is to analyze the philosophy of the changes they're putting through. We, as the old school player base, have a bit of an opportunity to give them feedback as they go through this iterative process. Today's video sponsor is the Ridge wallet, which look better, are more durable, and more usable than that dusty old boomer wallet you're probably still rocking. I went for a simple, sleek, jet black titanium that I really like. Ridge offer a lifetime guarantee on their products because they're built to last, and if you don't love it, you can send it right back. How are you gonna get a fairer deal than that? But I doubt you would want to, because there's 30 designs to choose from, meaning that there's going to be a style that fits you the best. Pick yourself up a Ridge wallet by checking out our link in the description to head over to ridge.com/YourOverwatch and use code YourOverwatch at checkout to get 10% off your entire order and free shipping. You'll find in the chapter markers different subsections for the different roles and subjects we're going to discuss. The first one's going to be all about tanks and subject matter connected to it. In our previous video, we covered Jeff Goodman discussing Doomfist being reworked as a tank, potentially. In the Ask Me Anything yesterday, he seems to be a little bit more enthusiastic about the change. He gets asked, do you foresee any heroes changing roles? And Jeff Goodman says, this is something we've been experimenting with and talking a lot about. No hero has moved roles yet though, but we're starting to test Doomfist as a tank. Of course, this means he'll lose some damage and gain some defenses. Some early feedback so far is that he's not really feeling like a tank without having at least one active defensive button, because his main defenses are passive at the moment, as in he gains more health when he lands offensive abilities. So that's something we'll probably try next. He also said, Doomfist's kit is full of crowd control effects and mobility, which makes it difficult to tune and balance him as a DPS in Overwatch 2. As a tank though, he can keep those key properties to his kit, since those can fit nicely into a tank role, mostly the crowd control stuff. If I may translate a bit of what he's saying, because I don't think everyone's just going to automatically assume the context he's discussing. As we've said in previous videos, the tank, or maybe even perhaps brawler role, as it might be reworked to be named, is where you're going to see the majority of crowd control effects. And I think you will probably find this surprising just by watching the gameplay in the background from the pros playing, where it used to be in Overwatch 1, there was all manner of DPS heroes especially that had crowd control effects that were devastating in nature. McCree's stun, Mei just getting her freeze beam on you a little bit, Doomfist's punch obviously can one-hit kill you. Although they're keeping some of that outside the tank category, like on a sleep dart, you're gonna find most of those kinds of effects to be expected to be in the tank category, and there's only one of them. The amount of CC we're gonna come to expect in Overwatch 2 is gonna be vastly lower, and it seems like the devs are really kind of scrambling to figure out how to make the game make sense under that new rule set. As Jeff says in this post, with that being the case, Doom's probably going to need some sort of self-tanking ability to have some sort of tanking interaction that isn't pure offense and health. However, it's not like Roadhog has too much of that for the team, so maybe Doomfist is like a different version of him? It's hard to say. I'm curious in the wording here from Jeff Goodman, saying he'll lose some damage and gain some defense. Does this mean that Rocket Punch, one hit killing you into a wall, does that go away? That's one of the major suggestions from high-level Doomfist players such as Chipza, arguing that it's a very difficult ability to balance because at the highest tiers, it's mostly used as an escape ability for its mobility, whereas at the lower ranks, being able to one-hit kill something in a crowd just by charging up an ability into them is a high amount of kill potential for a very low amount of skill, and not as much cost as like a Reinhardt pin, because Rein's a lot slower and easier to take down. But as I say that, maybe that is a better comparison. Would Doom's punch feel similar in a tanky way to Reinpin if it was balanced around that? And so maybe in some ways, Doom as a tank might be like a Reinhardt, with less defense and more mobility. When you think about Doomfist, is Seismic Slam radically different from Wrecking Ball's Pile Driver? And is Punch radically different than Pin? Both can one-hit kill. Maybe this won't be as crazy of a transition as we think. Jeff actually continues this discussion when asked about the role of Doomfist. Is he more about using his CC to push enemies into bad positions? Jeff replies in saying, yes, this can be a big part of his kit. For example, one thing we've tested is for Rocket Punch to create an area knockback around the target he impacts, creating a new ability to knock multiple enemies away or into walls. So this is an example of them taking some crowd control out of the DPS category, but making it scarier in the solo tank category. The post goes on to address mobility and rollouts. Jeff said, you don't have to worry about those changing because Doomfist's high mobility is a huge part of his kit and not going to change. In fact, it's part of what makes him potentially a good tank, being able to initiate fights for your team. And final question on this subject, he's asked, if he doesn't work as a tank in Overwatch 2, is he going to remain as a DPS with the same kit? Jeff says, this is tricky to be honest. In a world where almost all crowd control has been removed from non-tanks, Doomfist would be a huge outlier. Maybe there is a world where he can still exist as a DPS with less displacement and crowd control effects, but it would certainly be a challenge to make that work. So seems less likely, especially when you consider the new rules they're making and how do you make him deal melee damage without it being severe. It just doesn't really make much sense. I think they're going to have a much easier time making him into a tank, especially considering the comparisons I made earlier. The devs get asked, does it feel like some of the tanks take damage too quickly? For example, does D.Va get demech too quickly, or does it sometimes feel like a tank peeks a corner and gets instantly melted? Which I would contest is in many situations exactly how you feel in Overwatch 1, but Josh No goes to reply to this. We're certainly still experimenting with many different ways to ensure that tanks are powerful and satisfying to play in this new format. One of these experiments is seeing how far we can push tank base health up before the gameplay starts to break down. Some of the tank results have been surprising. D.Va specifically has ended up much more relatively powerful with only a second of extra defense matrix energy. She has other changes as well, but that one did some heavy lifting. Roadhog as well has had several experimental buffs along the lines of more damage reduction, resetting hook cooldowns, or even being able to cleanse himself of things like anti-heal that were taken out because he ended up being just so impactful at a base level, largely due to how valuable an early chain hook can be in 5v5. There's still some problematic mechanics we're working to resolve, like Orb of Discord being nearly always on a tank, or Echo Duplicate choice coming down to being the best on the buffed up tanks. Well, that's already the case, isn't it? He goes on to say, generally, we haven't found tanks to be getting blown up instantly unless they're hard, overextending, or aren't working with their team at all, in which case they should be vulnerable there. But of course, we'll have to see how that holds up at a professional level. I'm glad he said that because so much of these comparisons just don't make sense between the average player, which is sort of how they playtest for. I mean, some of the devs are GM, some of them are gold, it's all over the place, versus high-level play. A lot of the principles that we can see from high-level play translates from Overwatch 1, in my opinion. A character like Roadhog, right now, on live, Overwatch 1, can be outrageously powerful at the metal ranks, but is basically useless in pro play. So while Josh No says that they had to take out a bunch of Roadhog buffs they tried because they were too good in 5v5, they're also testing it in a non-competitive environment. It's very simple to see this even in Overwatch 1. If you are at a rank that you feel Ana gets clowned on by Roadhog, then Roadhog's gonna be insane, which I'm gonna say is like 95% of players. For the top ranks though, the target assignments are much more locked in terms of who you're setting up to succeed. In no way do I think they're going to find a balance in this game where a character is good in both contexts. On a recent podcast I was on with SVB and other creators, we discussed a lot of these changes, and one major theme that I began concluding is that it's going to be a lot harder to keep the game relatively balanced across a lot of skill tiers. Even worse than Overwatch 1, because the game is losing some of those like baseline interactions due to a lot of the power trying to bias towards skill more. What's latent in this line of questioning from the community is that I think we still don't fully understand how much of a shooter game Overwatch 2 is. Your assumption that we need a tank, we need a shield, if we don't have one, the enemy will have one and just walk over us, that's not what Overwatch 2 is. To further complicate matters, let's go with the next post, where the pros gave feedback that a character like Zarya was basically useless as the solo tank, even when she gets the buff to be able to use a bubble twice, either on herself or a teammate. The dev's response here says that they actually disagree with the pros. Let's see what Josh No has to say. He says, this is an interesting one we're keeping an eye on, since internally the resounding feedback has been that Zarya is far in the other direction, and many think she's too strong and constantly high energy with being able to bubble herself twice. There's a couple of details that get overlooked with this new shared cooldown setup, in that the duration of the barriers have been extended slightly, and the cooldown timer starts ticking immediately, unlike on live where the barrier has to be destroyed or time out first. So if the barrier isn't broken, your cooldown is coming up quicker than on live by some amount. The current internal cooldown is 9 seconds, and it's easy to tune that lower if she isn't performing well, but at some point it breaks down, and too many of those barriers quickly gets annoying to play against. He goes on to say, the flexibility to bury yourself twice in succession or an ally twice is also powerful utility in itself. Using both barriers at exactly the same time is the worst case scenario for cooldown management, but sometimes necessary. Part of the interesting gameplay can be making that choice. I'll expand on what I've said earlier about high and lower tier balance testing. Zarya in ranked has always been insane, mainly because the decisiveness of mixed teams is nowhere near as coordinated as pros. There were years of time where Zarya was never played by pros. So regardless of how this is reworked, we shouldn't be surprised that Zarya, who's like a ranked pub stomper character, doesn't perform in a pro context. Because the TLDR of Zarya in a pro context is that they avoid her, wait out the bubble, then pounce her. Whereas in ranked, there's more disorganization. The focus fire isn't quite there, so there's many opportunities for Zarya to extend, draw aggro in, get charge, and get out. Whereas the higher tiers you go, the intensity of the focus fire is so severe that you just know you don't let a Zarya survive, ever. Like, you'll go solo ult her in like a regroup just to get her charge back and spawn at 0. Whereas most players aren't that coordinated or don't respect the Zarya charge as much. So I'm gonna flag this as another one of those problematic balancing aspects that some of the few times Zarya has been playable, this is going back to like 2017 and then recently again in like the past year, double bubble with Winston, where you have a tank that would be weak to crowd control, jumps in with the bubble, can survive longer, and then get out. It like extends his playstyle, right? Well, you only have one tank now, so you need a DPS probably to be the one to go aggressive. And the question is, what are you getting out of that? With Winston, you cleave into the enemy team to work up towards primal, so you have a very consistent engagement loop. Even a character like Doomfist is going into the tank category, so don't even think of him as an option probably. Who else like hard commits? Maybe Genji with Dragon Blade? Reaper perhaps? Like, you would have to devise a pocket strategy where you're going to get value out of that character hard engaging in. Also keep in mind, Sombra in their build was outrageous. We'll get to her in a moment. But let's just say in a meta where mobility is king, what are you engaging on, right? Typically, those hard engaged type playstyles counter slow defensive playstyles because you have something to engage into. But if the enemy's playing mobile or crossfire poke, they're like always too far from you to close the distance, and you just get poked down and die. Maybe some of these responses from the dev team include heroes that haven't been released yet. In another post, Josh No did answer this, in fact, that there are many reworks and balance adjustments that we've seen that account for heroes that haven't been announced yet. So that adds a whole other wrinkle to this. Next question, what is your philosophy on how tank buster heroes such as Reaper, Echo, Hanzo, and more should be approached in Overwatch 2? Is the role of tank buster obsolete when there is only one tank? Josh No replies in saying, I think it's important to have a concept of these high damage output heroes, which each have their own limitations and trade-offs, though not necessarily to fulfill the role of specifically taking out tanks and barriers. This is especially true with the format change to one tank per team in 5v5, because it can give players more options to respond to a variety of challenges they may be trying to overcome in-game. More depth of team comps can lead to deeper gameplay. We have taken some tuning steps to make abilities like Storm Arrows and Echo's Beam less lethal against tanks, but still keep them powerful in other situations. So that's interesting. I want to highlight what he says here about him saying there'll be more depth to gameplay as there's more options to respond. I really think this answer, and perhaps a lot of Josh Knows answers here, are for the average level of play. We've already seen this in Overwatch 1 a bit, where because everything is so skill dependent, even with Overwatch 1 having a lot of abilities that are fairly rock, paper, scissors in nature, if you can't execute that hero's kit, they just don't do anything, which is how the game should be balanced. However, a lot of the texture that added to depth of gameplay, in my opinion, is a lot of like really easily powerful things. Symmetra is one of the top characters right now out of nowhere, where in previous times she's been useless, right? Well, the less bells and whistles you allow for an Overwatch team comp to have, and the more restrictive your rule set of what like a DPS can do, for example, what is Mei and Sim getting if their CC effects are worse? I think that's an obnoxious style of play that I'm not a huge fan of, but my question is, how do we keep that death ball comp existing in Overwatch 2 under these new rules? My assumption is like it's just going to be weaker, because if the game opens up more flanking, more about dealing damage, well, how does Mei and Sim as a DPS duo even fight back if so much of what they did was jump on the objective and isolate your tanks? Well, you only have one tank, so that metagame is just weak, right? I think it's more likely that lots of options are just no longer high tier viable, which I would say is the opposite of depth. I think that makes the game more shallow. It also makes the game reward skill more, but I think these are in conflict with one another. A character that I think about is Junkrat. If we already assume characters like Tracer or Widowmaker are automatically more of a scary threat in the Overwatch 2 category, then automatically you have to assume some of these more gimmicky damage options won't have anything to fight. I'll note, I think this is a strong change for the average player, but very likely to have much more severe meta limiting effects at higher tiers. Because whereas there are some opportunities for high tier players to play a lot of these gimmicky picks with the perfect team comp in the right situation, as weak as Junkrat's been, he even got played on Control Center a bit, dabbled with, attempted. I think the game's gonna be a lot simpler by design. So it's weird that he's saying it's more deep. Makes more sense if you assume he means for the average player who don't have the capabilities to max out every style of comp that emerges. Next question, discussing Sombra's balance, where the pros said she's insanely OP. Jeff Goodman goes to say, probably the biggest surprise for me was just how good pros thought Sombra was in this iteration. We had been playtesting those changes for at least a few weeks, and while she felt strong, she never felt like she was taking over the game. Obviously, pros with amazing game sense and coordination, they're going to be able to confirm kills a lot easier. We've since focused a bit on her numbers and tweaked her down a bit to try to keep her under control while still allowing her new kit to play well. I wish this type of thing wasn't a surprise for them, and hopefully with them ramping up communication with pro players and content creators, they don't have to spend weeks on a Sombra change that was obvious from a mile away, that it would be too strong in pros' hands. But the question I want to ask them is like, do we even care what pros are able to exploit? Because you can only fix one problem at a time. Sombra was too hard to play around and annoying for most players, basically useless at most tiers of play. I mean, unless you knew how to play her, but almost no one does. And that's not the devs' fault, that's the community's fault for not being very good at Overwatch. But if they want her to be a more straightforward damage dealer, where you flank around like a Tracer in a different way and deal damage, I think that's a good idea, but it should be no surprise to anyone that that was simply just better in a pro's hands, because the timing windows for playing around Sombra Hack Disable is about a second anyway. So them reducing it to a second instead of 6 or whatever it was doesn't change too much, and it's just a straight upgrade. Those are the kind of trade-offs they're gonna have to just decide on. Who are they willing to be on the chopping block, so to speak, at the average player or the pro player point of view? Because I'm almost certain with less complexity in the game and more distinct rules, solving the meta should be easier, but should also maximize for skill expression. We might lose some of the gimmicky comps that added diversity, but what we should gain is a more directly skillful meta. I'll say again, these two things are just directly at odds and not very different to problems that the dev team had early in 2017 when everything was dive meta and you had a lot of these heroes like Hanzo, Junkrat. Why do we pick any of these if the enemy plays a full mobility comp and just outskills us? Well, that's exactly what Overwatch 2 sounds like already, right? That doesn't sound to me like there'll be more competitively viable compositions. I think undoubtedly there will be less. Long story short, if you give Sombra the ability to hack while in invis and all these damage buffs, what's her downside exactly? If she does damage really easily and gets all this free positioning and you can't see her coming and she stuns out for combos, it's like she does every aspect of that kit. Whereas her downside used to be she was weaker in damage and had the personality of disabling and teamwork. Well, now she has less personality and is just stronger. There's a lot of picks, especially in the DPS category, that got a lot of guaranteed value just from targeting tanks. This kind of goes to their tank buster type question, which there are certain picks you can take where you can guarantee a result just from aiming that character's kit towards a tank in Overwatch 1, whether it be Mei, Doomfist, Junkrat, whatever. Without a lot of skill, you could guarantee that result. But if Overwatch 2 is going to open the door to skill mattering more and one less tank, it's like, well, they could just hide their tank and poke you out and you just have no play to make. There hasn't really been anything in their answers that explain this yet, but we'll keep an eye on it for you and see which direction they go. On the receiving end, as a tank, it's a bit of a nightmare to know your job is just to try to outplay the almost guaranteed death in front of you. But from a balance point of view, more DPS could be viable due to these other little gimmicks they could give each one. But as they admit, with the game having more of a shooter focus, well, do those gimmicks even exist anymore? Moving on, the next section is going to be all about supports. The dev team gets asked, how are you tweaking supports in Overwatch 2 with one less tank for them to heal, so less value for them to get, as well as one less tank to protect them? Jeff says, so far, broadly speaking, we found that supports are often more safe in a 5v5 environment because there's one less tank trying to dive and take them out. There are instances where this isn't true, like Sombra trying to assassinate them or being sniped easier without two barriers to hide behind. In those situations, it's a matter of just trying to position more carefully, or maybe Sombra's just a bit too OP right now, and he puts a goofy emoji here. Initially, we were worried that supports without mobility to escape might be weak in this environment, but so far, we've actually seen Zen and Ana being very strong instead of weak, because the nature of their offensive capabilities in a 5v5 environment. Another thing I wanted to point out is that I think out of the 3 role passives given, supports being able to self-heal is going to be the most transformative to gameplay. And just as a quick recap, the Overwatch 2 role passives so far have been described as tanks generating less ult when you shoot at them, which like is kind of a non-change for them, right? It's like, it doesn't really change how they play necessarily. It just lowers a bit of a result of taking damage, but the other change is reduce knockback. But I think that that is a less impressive of a change considering they're mostly just removing so much knockback from the game anyway. Knockback resistance on Reinhardt is a big deal when there's a lot of knockback in the game. But here's a interesting like game principle for you. Having a resistance to something gains in value the more required it is. And since the major benefactors of CC are tanks, it just means that CCing the other tank isn't as effective. But is that even so much of a thing? But with only one tank, there is less of that like death ball manipulation strategy even existing in the game anyway. So the main thing you feel, maybe Lucio can't boop you off as much, but in general, it's just like a weak passive is what I'm trying to say. If the game is more FPS focused anyway on the whole, that being a benefit isn't a big deal. Okay, then the other one is DPS get to move faster. That one's probably pretty good and maybe is a close second, but I think that supports being able to self-heal radically changes a major aspect of gameplay. The skill set of being offensive as Ana is normal anyway, even in Overwatch 1, but it's aided and amplified by a character like Mercy, making it kind of required to have Mercy's quick, responsive healing to function. But in ranked, where there's less teamwork, you more often see greedier support compositions like Ana Zen, which are actually really bad and like easy to counter in Overwatch 1 with tank play, but with tank play being removed a bit, the major downside of those supports probably don't exist. Each one of them can basically solo DPS, right? And they don't really need peel from the other one because they can solo heal, just like a Mercy can. What I'm effectively saying is it looks so far that the main support position, which is Lucio, Brig, and Mercy, is just sort of naturally eroding away a little bit, or at least their responsibility to peel for their support. I think we'll get into Mercy in a moment, but you basically just don't have to go babysit them is the long and short of it, which means if you have two offensively minded supports, they can play separate from one another without needing to babysit each other as much as you're expected in Overwatch 1. It'll still be required if they get overwhelmed, obviously, but the point is, DPS characters can't self-heal. Like, they move faster to get into position and close the distance faster, okay, sure, but it's not like they can hold a position by themselves. Most of them can't heal themselves. Supports often do as much damage as DPS. A lot of their damage values got buffed in the versions of Overwatch 2 we've seen so far from BlizzCon Online and this recent one, where they literally just are DPS now with more abilities. And I know what I'm saying somewhat is going to contradict some of the reviews that pros have said that supports feel weak in Overwatch 2. We didn't cover this as it very quickly got addressed by the Blizzard team as a change that isn't going to persist, and they just tried it out on that build. But it was the case in that Overwatch 2 pro build that healers did less healing in combat, which if you got attacked by an enemy for 4 seconds, you received less healing. A 25% reduction. What that resulted in is in the pro test footage, team fights would resolve quicker than we're used to, I think, because there just was literally less healing during fights than you're used to. I'm going to read off Josh No's reply to this as he explains the thought process behind trying it and then what they're going to do beyond this. So this is from Josh No. What we found from our internal playtesting is that generally support heroes have become the most impactful role by a wide margin, with overall less incoming damage on the field and with the reduction of a tank. Fewer high health pool targets try and keep up. This led to the average time to kill becoming much higher and many fights stalling out longer than we'd like. Not only healing outputs, but utilities like Mercy Res, Ana Sleep, Bionade, Zen Discord, etc. are even more impactful in a 5v5 world. The general approach was to reduce healing output by some amount, but we don't really know what that amount is on an individual level. A little peek behind the scenes for game dev, the blanket passive healing reduction with a new concept of being, quote, in combat is a shortcut for us designers to find an appropriate value of what it should be changed by, since to adjust the value from playtest to playtest, we only had to change that one number rather than edit every healing script value individually. I think he means here, like, we didn't have to redesign the whole game. They just made a whole blanket rule for healing values so they could test it and, like, nitpick it later. He goes on, the reason for the in combat rule was mainly because we already know from earlier tuning in Overwatch's history that when healing is too low, Mercy, Zen, Lucio especially, it's annoying to try and heal large health pool tanks between fights. We've considered adding a bonus heal multiplier to the tank role passive, but it also contributes to the issue of fights stalling out as mentioned above. It could still happen in some form though. Now keep in mind, this whole in combat idea isn't something that they're sticking to, but if I can try to translate why this is going to be so tricky for them to balance, a character that a lot of the pros went out and said was really bad was Mercy on their build, because she healed 50 a second and had this in combat healing reduction. But I think what we're forgetting is that the devs tried that in order to counteract how strong she would have been if they didn't try it. You can already do this in Overwatch 1, where if you have a teammate who's in a good position on an off angle, like a soldier, for example, or one that flies to get off angles, like Pharah, having a Mercy attached to them makes them almost invulnerable at 55-ish healing a second. So although their build, Mercy, was really weak, the alternative could be, with only one tank, it's always going to be impossible to deny multiple angles of threat. This is just a fact of life of them trying to make the game more shooter biased. If you want to be able to flank, well then the kit that's going to empower that naturally comes along with it. That already feels a bit lopsided in Overwatch 1, but I think it kind of has the threat to be the entire game in Overwatch 2 if they don't somehow reduce the impact of support utility. Another bit of food for thought for you. Remember how I said earlier there's all those DPS characters that used to get free value just by aiming towards tanks? Well, now that they want to make it more of a shooter game, you might have to actually be able to aim at squishies to confirm an elimination, as opposed to vaguely point an ability in a direction to confirm value. That might be a good thing for skill, but I think that's how you get to the point where they feel in their playtests, if they don't nerf healing in some way, that team fights just don't really resolve. Because what's fair to say is like healing is easier to land than headshots are. It's kind of like the long and short of it, right? So the pros probably wouldn't need that kind of change, but when you remove a lot of that kill potential that's easy to land, well, now you're just trying to like hit enough headshots on the tank to burst them down, but they get double pocketed. Okay, well, I'm gonna go to try to look for a kill on the backline. Well, McCree doesn't have stun, fan the hammer anymore. You gotta hit shots, okay? And there's a lot of tiers of play where players might not be able to hit enough successive shots to confirm an elim on a target that's receiving healing. Maybe questioned another way, although biasing towards skill is good, how much skill should you be required to have to secure an elimination in Overwatch 2? Being a boomer gamer, I can tell you, you look back to games like Quake, it's possible for a skill gap in a game to be so severe that you might never be able to land an elimination on a better player if they just run around the map and destroy you. That somewhat feels the case in Overwatch 1 when you're fighting a Smurf, but you always have tools that kind of can strategy your way to victory or get a leg up on them without a whole lot of effort. The game isn't just straight up mechanics, but making it more of a shooter gears it that way. DPS can have insane output, but they sort of require a certain skill threshold to get that now. But now in Overwatch 2, I think DPS is just gonna be even harder, which maybe is good for the higher tiers, but is gonna make the average player's DPS play a lot more difficult. I will note though, at the launch of Overwatch, that kind of was the case. Before Sombra and Doomfist, before characters like Torb, Sim, Mei were reworked to be good, a lot of these characters were just bad. And you had to straight up aim on Tracer, McCree, Genji. We've seen just pure skill-based DPS metas before. I think we're headed for that again. But if they don't change the support class, it might transition it to the DPS perhaps being irrelevant for medal ranks, but being the be-all end-all at the pro level. It's hard to imagine because the three roles have been mostly balanced throughout Overwatch 1's 2-2-2 life. But 5v5 with the new rules we're discussing, as Josh No's saying, if they don't nerf healing, it's like the only thing that matters for like an average level of play. What does an average level of play look like? Two teams square up and shoot each other's tanks, right? Well, when both tanks are more durable and there's only one to focus on, it's harder to find an opening in that. It'll be easier for DPS, but like I said, that takes mechanics to do now. So this is another one of those things we're gonna have to monitor how they even go to solve this problem. Hopefully explained in the months to come before release. Jeff Goodman goes to reply to a very similar question, but I think the core of their problem here is that tanks, when there's only one of them, have to be a bit tankier, so therefore their relationship to healing has changed. Something that they've said elsewhere in this post is that healing a target out of combat, if your healing is too low, feels bad. So as an example, as a Winston, being out of combat waiting for a Zen Orb to heal you from 1 HP to full, well, it's 30 heals a second, right? And you've got 500 health. I don't have to be a mathematician to conclude that takes a while. So long, you should just jump to a mega most of the time, right? This is an area they might just have to deal with. Maybe you just have more downtime in between fights if you want to get healed up. It's always interesting seeing their responses because they care a lot about the playability of that rather than the competitive balance of it, which is going to always be a blind spot for content creators like myself and especially pros, where I kind of could care less if it feels bad that you have to play smarter, but the game isn't just made for competitive balance, of course. It needs to be fun as well. But Jeff Goodman also goes to explain that the nerfs to Brig and Ana were to reduce the crowd control effects in the game. Ana's Sweep Dart cooldown was longer because, well, there's only one tank to block it. It basically can guarantee a follow-up kill pretty easily. They want to keep it on her kit because it's so cool, but reduce how often you can use it at least. Brig's rework is perhaps the most jarring, where her shield bash no longer stuns targets, but deals 50 damage in that build, goes much farther in distance, so it's better as a mobility tool, but also to close the gap on an enemy to start swinging on them, and goes through shields. All those buffs considered, I would doubt that it can rival the strength of a stun, which can add to a chain stun effect to fully immobilize a target when you combine multiple together. But I think a good read on this Brig rework is that she's being built in a way that she can engage with the mobility meta, which means although you might imagine she's a lot more vulnerable when the threat of her stun no longer exists, her positioning can be a lot more secure when she has a big dash, which is effectively what Bash is now, to get behind cover, to get behind her team, to reposition, to heal up from her Inspire. So she'll control a lot more of her mobility. And just having a shield, I think, in this environment is a lot better than you might think. Remember, a lot of reliable damage is reduced now that there's only one tank instead of two. I did notice as well that they buffed Brig's shield health. The devs were asked about ultimate generation because through the gameplay, you can tell that there are a lot less ults going around. This is because, of course, there's only one tank, but also this build has the healing reduction effect we spoke about earlier. Jeff explains that having ults happen less often was something we were targeting early on, and this tank change largely accomplished this by itself. You gain 25% less ult by shooting tanks. This is something that's super easy to iterate on though, and I'm sure we'll be tweaking it throughout the game's development / beta, etc. To further develop this stalemate effect that healing in one tank has happened that they're trying to address. Another thing that I was thinking about is that a lot of support ults are sustain in nature. So in the ult fight, we have one less tank ult and perhaps like 2 defensive ults. So I wonder how that affects the ult fight, even if they don't have that support healing reduction. It kind of makes sense in the mid fight where it's just easier to land healing than damage now. But I think even in the ult fight, you might find that having only one tank ult per 2 support ults might also bias the game a bit more towards sustain, if not somehow rectified. We can expect all these tuning knobs to be adjusted as the game gets developed, but it's surprising to me. It's just like the ramifications of having one less tank, it just keeps getting surprising what it actually affects. And the scope of what's going to need to still be changed, I think it's going to take quite some time for that to get worked out. Last up, the devs are asked about the Bastion rework. How did it perform compared to your expectations? Jeff Goodman said they did have some buffs to throw in that didn't quite make the deadline for the build. Bastion has been pretty tricky to tune with his rework, but has been great to see him play tested by these great players. I feel like the new design is solid. It's really just a matter of getting his numbers into a good place. Since the playtest, we've buffed him in a number of ways. He moves faster in sentry mode. His ult starts dropping faster, though the projectiles move slower, so you can see it coming a bit more. His recon fire rate has been increased, and other buffs. The tricky thing is, though, is when playing him, it can feel like you're still getting thrashed pretty hard because he's such a large hero. He is very easy to target and hit with everything, especially when he gets discorded, etc. There's a lot we can tweak with that as well, such as increasing his passive, Ironclad, to offer more protection while transformed. We also have new tuning knobs to help control his sentry mode, since it's on a cooldown now, and there's a duration associated with it. I'd say with this, it's another one of those characters that is just never going to be good at higher tiers, even more so in 5v5, unless he's broken. Disabling such a big target with an Ana sleep, or just in general having this big of a hitbox, it's not going to be a thing at high level play. I think what's most important is that Bastion just feels more fun for all players at metal ranks, where setting up a Bastion is just so obnoxious. It's just such an annoying type of skill check that doesn't feel good, whereas him being more active as a character could just be fun and fine. And that holds consistent to the other things I've said in this video. It's been a longer one. Let me know your thoughts responding to everything in the comment section down below. And if you haven't picked up a Ridge wallet yet, click our sponsored link as well. We thank Ridge for supporting the channel. That's been it for me, guys. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.